Well, hello, my name is Christopher Scott, and I am a small groups pastor of a local church. In this video, I'm going to give you a 5-minute introduction to the book of 2 Corinthians. A 5-minute introduction to the book of 2 Corinthians. In this video, I'm going to talk about 6 topics or 6 ways to introduce this book. I'm going to talk about the author of the book of 2 Corinthians. I'm going to talk about the audience that he was writing to. I'm going to talk about the date the book was written. I'm going to give you an outline of the book, a key verse of the book, really 2 key verses, and then the key theme of this book as you study it, okay? So, 2 Corinthians, right? So, it was written by Paul. The author is Paul. In our book, in our Bible, there are 27 books in the New Testament. 13 of those books were written by Paul, and 2 Corinthians is one of those 13 books that Paul wrote, okay? And the audience that he was writing to were the believers in Corinth, okay? The believers in Corinth. And these people he was writing to were interesting. They had a lot of pride in themselves and a lot of pride in their spiritual gifts, okay? So Paul had been there in Corinth in 50 AD. He stayed there for about 18 months in 50 AD, starting their church there and planting the church there, right? And you can read about that in Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 17, where he goes to Corinth and stays there, right? So that's in 50 AD that he goes there and stays with them. And it's interesting, Paul wrote 4 different letters to the believers in Corinth after he left there, right? 4 letters. In our Bible, we have 2 of those letters that still exist. So there's 2 other letters that maybe have disappeared or been lost, okay? So, how do we know there's 4 letters that Paul wrote to the believers in Corinth? Okay, well, first off, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he referenced a previous letter that he had already sent to them. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he references a previous letter he had already sent to them. So there's that previous letter. Then there's 1 Corinthians that was sent in about 57 AD from Ephesus, right? He was in Ephesus when he wrote that letter. And then the 3rd letter that Paul wrote to the believers in Corinth was a sharp letter, okay? A sharp letter that was carried by Titus, and you can learn about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. And it's this very sharp, pointed, direct letter that Titus carried to them. That's the 3rd letter. And then the 4th letter is the book of 2 Corinthians, is the letter of 2 Corinthians, where Paul is kind of expressing his satisfaction for the change of attitude of the believers in Corinth. So that's the audience that he was writing to, an audience that needed 4 different letters for him to correct and teach and coach, but that's interesting, right? I mentioned the date of this letter is in 57 AD, likely is when Paul wrote the letter, 57 AD, and it's written about I'd say 7 months after 1 Corinthians, pretty short, half a year, right? So he wrote it in 57 AD, about 7 months after he had already written 1 Corinthians to them. And to give you a little backdrop, 57 AD is kind of abstract if you don't have a little context, right? So Jesus likely was killed, buried, and resurrected and went to heaven in probably 30 to 36 AD, roughly in there. Different people disagree about the date. So 30 to 36 AD. And then we have 2 Corinthians written in 57 AD. The last book of the New Testament to be written was the book of Revelation in 95 AD, right? So we're kind of right in the middle there. And the first 2 books of the New Testament that were written were the books of Galatians and James, were written in 49 and 50 AD. So we're pretty early on in the process of the New Testament being written when we say 57 AD. Likely none of the Gospels had even been written at this time, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke were probably written in the early 60s, right in there roughly. And then John, the Gospel of John, was written in 90 AD. So this book of 2 Corinthians likely was written before any of the Gospels even existed. So it was very pivotal and important for people getting to know who Jesus was, what he did, and what that meant for us as believers. There's an outline of the book of 2 Corinthians I really like by Warren Wiersbe. He has this commentary, Be Encouraged, God Can Turn Trials into Triumphs. And he outlines the book of 2 Corinthians in 3 ways that I really like. The first area, the first section, is that Paul explains his ministry. That's the first 7 chapters. Paul explains his ministry. Second, Paul encourages their generosity. That's chapters 8 and 9. And then third, Paul enforces his authority. That's chapters 10 through 13, right? So Paul explains his ministry, Paul encourages their generosity, and then Paul enforces his authority, okay? So Warren Wiersbe, he gives in his commentary 2 key verses of the book of 2 Corinthians. 2 key verses 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1 and 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 6 are two key verses that kind of sum up what the entire book says and talks about. So let me find that for you here as I find 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since God, in his mercy, has given us this new way, we never give up, right? So during tough times, we never give up. Verse 6, for God, who said, let there be light and darkness, has made this light shine in our hearts so we could know the glory of God that is seen in the face of Christ. So there's a difficult world around there. There's tough things that we go through, but we can pursue God and have triumph during our trials. That's really what he's saying. And the key theme of this book is God's encouragement, right? So if you want to study the book of 2 Corinthians more, maybe with your small group or on your own, I encourage you to get the Bible study guide by Warren Wiersbe, God Can Turn Your Trials into Triumphs, and then the commentary by Warren Wiersbe on 2 Corinthians called Be Encouraged, right? I'll have links to both these books down there below in the description. They're affiliate links to Amazon, so I do get a small commission if you buy something, just so you know from there. So if you found this video helpful, I encourage you to subscribe and get updates on future videos. You can subscribe up there. If you want to learn how to use the Warren Wiersbe Bible Study Guide in your small group for 2 Corinthians, I have that video up there. If you want to find other 5-minute introductions to books of the Bible, I got those down there. And then I have some small group facilitator tips for you down there. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you again soon on another video.